All right. Hello, and I will apologize in advance if my voice gets a little scratchy or if I start coughing. I am still getting over the last dregs of the cold that hit me last week. So, it is, basically, my voice may be a little scratchy at times, and I may suddenly cut off as I attempt to frantically mute. I should probably set up my mute button so I can hit the mute button in time. It does save you from my horrible random coughs, which is still coming for me. But in any case, all that aside, that's not what we're here to talk about today. What we're here to talk about today is the fact that we're talking about espionage, spies, thrillers, covert action, and mysteries, and those types of games. Let me... Music loud. Be less loud, music. Let me calm you down there. Oh, that's too little. I have turned you off, my friend. There we go. Now you're just really pleasant background stuff. That should be background music. Music on, music back. Gotta love the delay when you're always just like, how soon is too soon? Let me actually switch to planning. Ah, it's me. I'm here. Music should be back. Music should still be there. It's me, my head in the white space. Let me try to get a little bit more exciting than just white space. It's back. Good for it, music. Good job. So I do need to turn it down almost in my ears because it's a little loud in my ears. Let me dial that back slightly. There we go. Basically, I apologize. It's a new music set that I'm working with, and so I have to rebalance everything and get it to work correctly. All right. Cool. So we were starting to talk about lore link, and that's why that black space is over there. I got everything else ready and prepped and ready to go, and I forgot to actually, do this thing. Hey, look, it's a lore link. And hey, let's talk about this thing right here first. Just as basically a quick ad at the top of the stream. We'll talk about it at the end of the stream. But this Friday, basically stop by at 1 p.m. and we'll be playing the One Ring game. Basically, we're playing the adventure, the Conspiracy of the Red Book. Mike will be running it. I will be playing a Hobbit. 20 will be joining us. I believe Luna will be joining us. And I believe, friend of the stream, Wolfmom will also be joining us. So it'll be a good time. So check that out. Set your calendars for 1 p.m. on Friday. Check us out doing that. So, what are we talking? So what we're talking about today, however, is that thing known as espionage, thrillers, spy games, things like that. So we'll talk a little bit first about how spy game, basically what type of spy games there are out there, and what we exactly mean by approximately 1 p.m. Yeah. Start times are always subject to technical errors, shall we say. In any case, what we are talking, basically spy games, basically espionage games, I'm talking about in particular the idea of the fact that you're running a game which generally they tend to be more modern, possibly slightly future, possibly past, but probably within 100 years or so of present day. It's a wide range, I know, but 1920s, your Call of Cthulhu type stuff, and games of that ilk. You can see a lot of games like that really kind of be played in that. Basically, that thing. You also can get cool, futuristic cyber, like your cyberpunk stuff is your far outer edge of it. You can get a little bit of, you can see a little bit of that if you're running, basically, possibly if you're running a thriller and espionage in a Shadowrun or a Cyberpunk Red, basically, or Hardwired Island or something like that. Those are going to be basically, you're going to have some similar things to what we're talking about, but mostly what we're talking about are going to be more centered around within probably we'll say 30 to 40 years, maybe up to 60. 1960s spies are basically very common. Obviously, basically James Bond in that era popularized a lot of what people think of when they think of spy fiction. And so playing in that time period basically appeals to some demographics. And basically that tends to be a little bit more of your suave spy, secret gadgets, James Bond-esque. You get a little bit further in, you get your 80s, you get your 90s, you're probably leaning a little bit more into Mission Impossible, both the TV show and the movies with Tom Cruise that came out afterwards, which are two totally different things with vaguely related titles. And basically, you have 2000s era. Basically, you get your Jason Bourne, The Accountant. I'm trying to think of it. Basically, some more. The Transporter, less so. Oh, the Composer of Mission Impossible theme passed. Oh, that's sad. But basically, that's kind of your more 2000s. And basically, like your 2020s. Basically, The Accountant is probably one of the more recent one. Obviously, the most recent James Bond movies have a slightly different feel than all your other ones. They're a little bit grittier. Trying to think of other, basically more recent thriller. There's one which is right in the back of my head, which is just refusing to come out. But even the newer Mission Impossible, compared Jack Ryan, basically things like that. Basically are going to be your more modern type. And obviously, basically, you're going to have to take the gauge of your players of what they're going to want to feel with. Basically, I'll be talking basically like, I talk about conspiracies in the title and things like that, and that's obviously like that's kind of the big joke. Obviously, like secret government conspiracies to take over the world. Basically, organizations with 4-letter, 5-letter names that are always sinister that spell out something absolutely ridiculous, which obviously was backronymed in after they picked the sinister word that they wanted, like Spectre, Smersh, and other such great names like that. But basically, obviously, you need to take the temperature gauge of your group because obviously conspiracy theories these days have gotten a little bit more close to home, let's just say. And so people may wish to not to basically deal with that. Basically, whenever you're dealing with modern stuff, realize that ripped from the headlines can sometimes mean that you're pulling on stuff that has personally affected people in your group, and their tragedies are not your playthings. Don't do that. It's a bad way of playing. That aside, what spy games tend to have is they tend to be a little bit more global in focus. They tend to be basically a little bit, I won't say necessarily global, but they tend to be a little bit more travel in focus. And that means when you're basically, if you're building out a campaign like that, you're basically a more globe-trotting campaign. Obviously, one of the things you're going to want to start with, let's just go ahead and just create basically just, we'll call it spy fiction. There are tons of them out there already. Basically, systems, we'll talk a little bit about different systems here in a bit. Obviously, content warnings are going to be applicable here, depending on what level you're going to want your players to be going for. And that's probably a good thing to establish up front, because as we were just talking about, obviously, when I say a spy thriller, an espionage thriller, I might think James Bond, where the most horrible thing that happens is someone falls into a horrible trap, and you know something terrible has happened to them. Someone gets painted gold completely and is found on a bed, and they died horribly, but all you see is just a gold painted person. People get shot and they get little red splotches, and then they fall over out of sight, and they don't spread pools of blood, they just die. Someone else may basically more recent stuff, which gets a little bit more claustrophobic, a little bit more intense. Others may think more tortured. Maybe you're doing a 24 inspired things, and the number of times that basically Jack basically had to interrogate somebody during 24 to get the information basically immediately, and so you had torture and things like that. May not go over well with some of your players. So basically, make sure you establish what type of spy fiction this is up front so that your players have a good sense of, oh, okay, we're going for PG-13, we're going for light R, we're going for heavy R, we're going for G or PG. Basically, possibly you're going for comedic effect instead. Those are also basically a comprehensive session 0. I hear you saying yes, indeed. And basically, session 0, basically planning before your first game is important. Session 0. So basically, I talk about them a lot in basically all the stuff I talk about for intro GMs. Basically, I mentioned session 0s. They're very important to just kind of establish these ground rules. And they don't have to be 4-hour-long meetings. They can be just you establishing things like in these content warnings here, in this description here. They could be text chats on a group text thread. It could be basically if it's a play-by-post thing, it could be that introductory post. Basically, possibly some direct messages back and forth. Just make sure you're establishing what's going on. And basically, session 0 is also important from the standpoint of you're going to want to, and basically, your players are most likely working as a team. And that is going to mean the fact that you're going to want them to have complementary skills. Whoever it is, you, basically necessarily as the GM or director or head agents, or basically whatever the game system calls you, or the group who has or the person who has brought this group together. And so it makes sense that your players all complement each other if you brought them together. And that means that your players should talk to each other and discuss what they're doing. Basically, a lot of times, using shows like A-Team or Mission Impossible or other team-based shows, even 24, Scorpion, and basically other kind of team-based, thrillers, fiction, spy fiction type shows. You're going to have easily identifiable roles that you can pull out for each of your players. You're going to have probably a face. Basically, the person who's going to be the smooth talker, who's going to be able to smooth their way through situations, is going to be able to talk the talk past guard, basically do things non-violently. Leverage is another show, of course, it just immediately popped into my head. They're going to be that person who can talk their way out of situations. You're going to have your tech person, the person who's going to be able to hack anything, who's going to be able to get the information, even if it's not necessarily easily accessible. Get the plans, help the setup, get the gadgets, maybe. Bypass security in an emergency, etc., etc. You're going to have probably a muscle type that everyone's going to have probably some form of combat. Usually spy fiction, it comes down to at some point someone ends up with guns drawn. But your muscle is going to be the person who, when guns start getting drawn, they're the one who steps forward. They're the one who steps between the face and the guard who they've managed to piss off. And they're going to start doing that. Let's start recording some of these here. Just so and then it's a good way using LoreLink to kind of set this up so your players know, hey, these are the roles which are available. So face, muscle, techie. And a lot of times you'll end up with the dexterous type, the thief, the cat burglar is probably kind of a better way of putting it. The person who can actually pull off a heist if necessary, to get in, get out. And a lot, basically, you want to kind of establish these roles up front. If you have a 4-person group, you're probably looking at everybody is kind of specializing. But yeah, well, exactly. Basically, a team is the perfect example of basically a lot of times. Basically, in the last role you'll sometimes have. This one is going to be up to you. If you make someone specialize in just driver or pilot, you'd better be ready to have chase scenes happen basically during your games. Otherwise, the person who specializes in driver is going to be bored. Because a lot of time, basically, you don't think of basically, the driver gets you in and then gets you out, but then there's a large chunk in the middle where they're not doing anything. And so if you're like, basically, either they need to specialize in other stuff, they need to be able to be a sub backup to another player. Sub muscle is an easy one to slot them into. They've got some tech skills. Or if driving in your system is a little bit more dex based or reflex based, cat burglar or something like that is obviously could be a good backup. Having the face up as someone else who could also be in disguise, if the person happens to be that basically can help get them in, etc., and then can basically disappear and let the face do more talking if they need to go get the car, boat, airplane ready. But it's good to present these kind of if your players aren't thinking along these lines during session 0, guiding them down these lines is going to be good, because what you don't want to end up with is you come to your first session and everybody's playing the face. That's great. They can schmooze their way through stuff, but basically dice rolls go wild. Things happen. They need to get away. They need to get out. And sometimes you can't schmooze your way into a vault. I mean, maybe you can. You're going to have to deal with that. Basically, if your group says, no, we all want to play faces, be prepared. Basically, you hopefully know that in advance so that your adventures tailor to that so that you can best give them their players. So basically, there's time to shine. So it's a lot. Basically, a lot of times when we're talking about fantasy RPGs and things like that, basically you think about the combat roles and things like that, and a lot of times you're like, oh, okay, this is the DPS, this is the mage, this is your DPS, this is your healer, this is your magic person, and you're like, oh, okay, basically this is your brute force, in your face, muscle type person, tank. It's easy to get those roles established, and you know how to play around them because you're used to dealing with them. You need to deal with those in other adventure situations as well, but basically in spy thrillers, they tend to fall into these categories, and it makes it easier if you remind your players with a list like this when you're like sharing your campaign, and then they basically are like, okay, you're taking techie, cool. Basically, get me your information for techie, and we'll update the techie with your character's name. And then from then on, it's just the character's name in there, and you've got that information ready to go for them, and everybody could see what they are. But this is a good reminder of, okay, this is what we need to be taking care of. This is what we're looking for when we're talking out how we're going to play this game. And it's also good, basically, to get a good handle on what your group is looking to. Again, like we just talked about with the driver, okay, I need to get chase sequences in here. I need to have these sorts of things. I need to be prepared for maps to matter, because they're going to want to basically be like, oh, we want to get from point A to point B. And if you don't have a driver, you can hand wave it. You get from point A to point B. Cool. Maybe a role from somebody or somebody else in the group to basically maybe a single instance. If you have a driver, though, you may be like, okay, no, let's actually play this out. Let's make this interesting. Let's make this exciting. Let's give some stakes to this so that the driver can help the situation along, or set up or by failure, set up an interesting situation further on down the line. The guards are right behind you. Basically, the police. You've got to burn these identities, and so that means later you may have to, or basically the scene at the airport is more basically now there's a scene at the airport because you know that the police know that you're leaving by a commercial airport, and they're looking for you, and so now that's a whole different scene that you had to plot out and plan. So I've talked a lot about generals, and that's kind of basically about session 0 and things like that. And again, so what you're getting out of your session 0 is you're going to want to get what the group what the group is feeling. Now this is a back and forth because this system entry here, a lot of the time, spy fiction, especially if you're the more gadget heavy and more equipment heavy your game is, the more you're going to heavily rely on your system to give you help. Just because of the fact that if you're playing a fantasy game, a sword is a sword, a shield is a shield. Magic items can be whatever you want. If you want your magic item to be a stick that causes fire to float in front of them and then they can cause it to explode, cool, that's relatively easy to figure out. Tech gets weird because basically gadgets and others and guns and ballistic armor and things like that. Basically, you'll notice that whenever you pick up a lot of these books, a lot of times you're going to have books which are just going to be big, thick books, which are just going to be, they'll have some cool name like The Armory or Tech Operations or Guns and Gear or things like that. And they're just going to be pages and pages and pages of stats for tons of real world things or semi-real world or close to real world things that your players that some of your players are just going to eat up. That basically, I know a lot of the times I love flipping through those things and pulling out ridiculous, wild, random stuff. Like, oh, hey, this is a wild shotgun that has this automatic barrel. It has these type of slugs. It does all this wild stuff. Am I ever going to use it in the game? Probably not, because the GM's like, that thing's ridiculous, and I don't know why. But basically, if I do get to use it once in a game session, wow, I feel awesome because I pulled out this one thing and it does a super cool thing. They talk about in one of the books I'm looking. They talk about one of the agents being like, I'm going to pull out the bad guy's getting away in a helicopter. Cool. I've been waiting for this. I'm going to dump all my points into prepared this, which is a stat that the system has for I was ready for this, and pull out a shoulder-mounted rocket launcher and then fire it. And so depending on the system you're in, it's going to be hang on. If you have a system that has those stats for you, the resolution will be a lot smoother and faster than if you're trying to figure things out on the fly, if it's a more technical system. And so when you pick your system, you're going to want to kind of pick a system that supports the era and level of techiness that your players want to play. If your players are just like, we want to play something silly and zany and wacky and over the top and guns do bullet damage, maybe you're looking for more of a feng shui or Outgunned has some stuff. Its list of guns is much shorter. Feng Shui's list of guns is much shorter than, say, for example, let me see if I can't pull one up. Let's see here. Spycraft is one of those systems which is it is an old school. This is 2.0. This is the new version of it, but it is very definitely based on the old 3.5 Pathfinder First Edition. We've got numbers for everything, and boy howdy, we're going to use all of them. And so you're going to want to see them. And so gear starts on page 210. My PDF is wildly off. There we go. But basically, gear is like 210, and it basically goes for basically approximately 100 pages worth of gear. And so that is stuff like page number. That's the wrong page number. Thank you. Just give me 270. There we go. And basically, I know it's barely readable because it's basically, but just pages and pages and pages of stats on different weapons and things like that, and basically what this particular piece of gear does in this system. Basically, what this does is it does mean the fact that you have a bunch of cool stuff that you can throw at the players, that you have mechanics for already dealt with and at least somewhat balanced. I always stir that up because obviously the bigger it is, the more chance there actually wasn't that as much balancing as you'd like. But basically, and so basically you're going to pick your system, basically pick the system that supports that level that you want to play with, as well as kind of the time frame and mood that you want to play with. So what basically some of this basically what type of systems are there? Spycraft is one I just pulled out. Basically the first one, that is your I want to play D&D-esque. Basically my players are coming directly from D&D, and I like a stat set heavy system that everything is roll a d20, add a bunch of numbers, get a final number, and that's it. Less guesswork on my part as a as a DM. More numbers for my players. More math. It's got base attack bonuses, it's got classes, which helps a lot with the, hey, I want to make sure my players see exactly what, basically see the fact that they need to be different roles, and helps put them into that mindset a little bit better than just, hey, here are some stats. Basically, here's some skills you can put stuff into. It's a little bit harder on, basically, it's going to fall into that trap of a lot of, basically what a lot of D&D games fall into, and a lot of Pathfinder First Ed games fall into, is you're going to give people a bunch of cool buttons, 90 of which are going to be related to combat, 90% of which are going to be related to combat, which means, in general, when push comes to shove, they're going to push the combat buttons because they've got a sheet full of them, so they're going to want to use them. Don't play your players for keep getting into, well, basically, they seem to be really combat. Like, oh, I look at their character sheet, they're like, cool attack, cool attack, cool attack, cool out of combat ability. Like, oh, wow, I've got all these cool attack things. Might as well, I'm going to use it to disable the guard, take it out. I'm going to get more physical, because that's what the system is going to kind of lean you into. Things like sneak attacks for rogues, things like that, are going to kind of lead you more into that. So that's kind of your spycraft. Basically, spycraft is that. Basically, 2.0. But it's great if you've got players who love flipping through books and pulling out. Basically, they're like, what if I had this particular weapon, which I saw at a TV show once, or heard a buddy mention once as being a cool gun? They've got a stat for it buried somewhere in the book. Cool. Basically, if you want to go a little bit more, basically lighter, but still have still be kind of percentile and class kind of base, covert ops is another one, which is it's definitely more, has skills, has attributes, basically straightforward, roll a d100, get under your skill. Basically that's your system. straightforward type thing. It does basically, it's part of a system known as the bare bones system, which means it gives out things which will enable you to basically enable the players to deal with bad rolls, or basically say, I don't need to roll in this particular circumstance, or this thing just sort of happens. I'm spending these markers that I've been given to make cool stuff happen. Because the dice might say X, but as a player, I still want cool things to happen, and so I'm going to have these abilities to mitigate that. That is something that your spycraft system tends not to have, as your 3.5 edition D&D and Pathfinder tended to be a little bit more, you roll the dice and keep going. Basically, their way of dealing with, I keep failing is we'll get bigger numbers, and then throw the bigger numbers at the problem. And when you have the biggest number, you're probably going to succeed. But it is, basically, it still has a kind of a class-based type system in terms of, basically, you've got classes like this, you've got the art, basically, they've got origins. It's a little bit, basically, origins are a little bit looser than necessarily a class, but they're still going to kind of guide you in a direction. They're things like, they're basically like academic, detective, leader, martial artist, medic, things like that. And that's going to be, basically, those are skills. Sorry, those are the skills. Origins are clergy, criminology, diplomat, entertainer. Then basically your skills are things like academic, detective, leader, martial artist, medic. Basically, it's a smaller, reduced list of skills, but it's still a relatively straightforward roll a D100, compare it type system. Top Secret is a little bit closer. Basically, Top Secret is closer to, I would say, a kids on bike type system. Basically, it's the system. That system is not you. Basically, the system of dice. Basically, it's dice for skills. Isn't unique to Kids on Bike, but I'm going to say Kids on Bike is probably one of the more popular systems to have used it. And it is basically, you have a D4 in this skill. You're not great at it. You have a D8 in this skill. Oh, okay. I've actually got some skill. I've got a D10 or a D12. Wow, you're really good. Basically, things that are difficult, your dice skill, basically things which are easier, you get better at it, you have higher dice. Kills on Bikes is a whole different feel than Kids on Bikes. Ha. Excuse me. But it is based on an old, much one of the first, basically spy games, Top Secret. Basically, this is Top Secret New World Order from Solarium, I think. It is the newer version of it. We were actually across from them at Origins 2 years ago. But it is basically again D4, D6, D8, D10, D12. If you roll the max on the die, you re-roll it. If you roll ones, bad things happen. So D4s are basically high risk, high reward. Basically, you get some of that fun, basically fun kind of stuff can happen. They do offer options. Basically, those are just your attribute dice are the only ones that can explode. They say if you want to make it more cinematic, which I guess in their case means swingy, any dice can explode or basically blow back. So, but basically, it's a relatively straightforward system in terms of here's a D4, that's your skill, roll it. Oh, you roll a 4. Your target number is 13 most of the times. Most of the time, you're rolling 2 times your attribute dice. So, most of the time, if your target number is 13 and you're rolling 2d4, basically, it is unlikely that you'll make it. But the odds of the odds of maybe it's not impossible, and there's a lot of chances that you will explode into it because you have a 25% chance of rolling a 4. So that would be 4 plus whatever you roll again. And then plus another d4. So the average on 2d4s is 2.5. So your swinginess in there can help you out there. Basically, and also dice exploding is fun and exciting. It's a lot, basically, like, it's going to happen a lot more often than rolling a 20 on a d20, or rolling a 100 on a d100. And so it's going to feel a little bit more exciting and basically action-packed because your players are going to get those bursts more often, and so it's going to feel like, oh wow, cool, things are happening, things are exploding, things are basically I'm getting these cool, awesome big rolls where I blow out the doors and basically my spy does something really cool and awesome. And so that's going to lend that feeling, basically, if you're wanting your game to be a little bit more exciting and action and basically tense in terms of like, oh, I don't know, I don't have a good chance of this, red wire, blue wire. Basically, roll the dice, figure it out. Oh, we got it. We succeeded. Basically, because I managed to get a lucky burst and we escaped from that situation. And that'll be important for the feel later, which we'll talk about here in a bit. And so, basically, that is Top Secret New World Order. Then... basically, there is the two last ones I talk about. Basically, we're going to talk about are going to kind of lump together. Night's Black Agents and Delta Green. Delta Green, I'm not going to talk about a whole lot, but both of them are paranormal spy fiction in their base form. Basically, Night's Black Agents is you find out that there's a conspiracy of vampires running the government, and now it's your team either goes rogue or is tasked by one department is feuding against another department, and oh yeah, and so it's that idea of the fact that basically, so you've got vampires running things, you've got basically your agents are dealing with things beyond their basically a little bit beyond their scope of control. So you're stretching the fiction a little bit in terms of things don't behave necessarily the way your players would expect them to. And that may be what your players want, or it may not be. Basically, one of the cool things about being a spy is basically you're suave, you're in control, you know what's going on. James Bond may get surprised by the scope of the villain's scheme, but not that the villain could even do it at all, or that the villain even exists. Like, he's not surprised that Mr. X exists, or has a laser which could destroy the world. He just knows that he needs to stop them from using the laser to destroy the world. But he's not unfamiliar with the idea of a laser that could destroy the world. Sure, that could happen. Basically, James Bond believes that sort of things. Whereas, basically, a vampire who he pumps a bunch of bullets into, then stands back up and keeps coming for him and rips his buddy's throat out, that's going to give your group a different feel. It's a little bit more like, whoa, hey, basically, my contact died when something came through the window and dragged him off into the sky, is different than, basically, a dart through a window, basically poisoned them halfway through. They're giving, basically, just when they're about to tell me where the secret documents are stored. Basically, along those same lines is Delta Green, which is kind of the extreme end of it. Delta Green is probably closer in comparison to Call of Cthulhu than it is to the spy games I'm talking about. It's the idea of the fact that there is... basically there is that. It's the idea of the fact that there is a group of agents who are tasked with holding normality up in the face of the unspeakable, the impossible, eldritch beings from beyond. and it carries with it that same sort of sense of that Call of Cthulhu has, which is, this is not a winning war, this is a stalling action. Your job as agents is to deal with whatever the current incarnation is that's poking through and shove it back into the closet, but you're not going into the closet after it, because anybody who does is going to die horribly. And in fact, just shoving it back into the closet might mean that you don't come back the same. It's interesting from the standpoint of the fact that it likes to base, basically a lot of its agents and stuff is based in boring vanilla normality. And so basically you people that you're playing aren't necessarily super spies a la James Bond. They're relatively normal people who have gotten pulled into this and are just trying to get back home at the end of the day to try to sort whatever they can of basically a normal life. It is extreme to the point where basically it has stuff like, there is things like therapy for your characters in order to keep them more sane, that your characters can basically deal with as they can deal with the fact that they're slowly dealing with it. There actually is rules for therapy. So again, that may come down to content warnings, depending on mental health issues, depending on basically your group may or may not feel comfortable with role-playing therapy. But that is out there if you're wanting to play it as more of a, I want more paranoia, I want more surprise and shock, and I want to throw my players into the deep end and them not then have a clue what's going on. And I want them to feel lost and confused, and basically so it feels really cool when they manage to piece together even just a little bit of the puzzle, basically get their hands around just the tiniest fraction of it, and basically like, oh, that was super cool. We managed to get that much done when the odds were that much stacked against us. That's kind of what Delta Green goes for. Delta Green basically has some amazing adventures written from it. It's kind of like Mothership in that the system itself is kind of, yeah, it's okay, it's there, but they've written some amazing adventures for the system, which have done a lot of the work of how do you write madness as a plot point. How do you write a world that can't be? How do you write an adventure explaining what can't be explained? And so they've done a great job with some of that as well. So that's the far end. If you're like, I want my players to be dealing with conspiracies so vast they can't understand them and they're just flailing in the dark and kind of succeeding and happy for just that. Whereas your far end on the other end is your 1960s stuff. One I didn't talk about because I didn't have time to look at it. That came from Classified is another one, which is really pulling from 1960s basically spy stuff. Your feng shui, your outgunned, your work. Basically, we can figure out there's a guy with a space laser and it's pointed at Washington D.C. and we're going to have to hijack a NASA rocket, fly up there, and punch the guy who's about to press the button on the space laser in the face in 0G. And then we're going to come back home and go out to celebratory cocktails. Because it's all been taken care of, and there are no consequences to what we did, except that we all get medals and cool stuff until next time when the villain mysteriously returns. That's your far end. That's your other end. And basically you've got other stuff in the middle, basically Night's Black Agents, basically agents, spycraft, covert ops, top secret, which are going to kind of be your stuff in the middle. So, all that to say, pick the system that both meets the theme of what you're wanting to play and what you think your group is going to want. Basically, it's going to be one of those where basically you have to have a pitch to give your group. Don't rely on you're the GM, you're the game master, you're the director. Approach your group with something. Don't try to. It doesn't really work as well if you try to play it as much by, hey, let's vote. because a lot of times the problem is if you go with the let's vote approach is you're going to present 4 different options to them, and someone is going to fall in love with A, and then someone else is going to fall in love with B, and then the group will vote for A or B, and so that person is always going to be like, oh man, I really wish we did A. As opposed to if you present the group with, we're going to do this, everybody is going to be a little bit more able to basically pull what they want out of the scenario and be like, oh, okay, cool, you're running something. And a lot of times that's the cool thing is, oh, cool, we finally get to play a spy thriller. We've been wanting to play a spy thriller for forever. Basically, and no one's been willing to run it, and you're willing to step up and run it. Remember that a lot of times as a GM, that's going to be that you are the hero who is doing this, who is taking the time, who is running this. The players don't see you flailing behind the scenes. They see you giving them an awesome story. Don't overthink that. Basically, don't overthink it too much and be like, oh gosh, I messed up this, or I didn't do this right, or I wish this had happened, or et cetera, et cetera. Players just had fun. The players basically had fun chucking dice playing the game. Yes, you know that there are ways that could have gone better. Yes, you know that there's a cool story in your head that didn't play out exactly right. But basically, your players don't see that, and so it's still a success. Take that home. Be comforted by that. So all that to say, how do you run a spy game? What's a spy game like? What does a spy game feel like? Basically, if I come into Lore Link, what am I going to do with it? We already kind of started off with basically getting the player roles out there for a session 0 to set that up, so you get a feel of what type of characters your players are running or throwing at this scenario. So when you're planning for this, I oftentimes talk about basically painting with broad strokes. And that's that is just as important here, but there are some exceptions too. Basically, when you're running a spy game, a thriller game, I might actually start with starting with events might be the right way to do this, because using events to kind of build out your skeleton that you want. Now, I'm going to pause briefly and kind of throw an ad in. Basically, Night's Black Agents, while it isn't necessarily the best system for every spy thriller game you may want to run, it's the gumshoe system, which some people have problems with because it is very, very heavily based on the idea of detectives and clues, and it's very much your players to basically do X thing, get X clue, and then advance to the next thing. And it's built around getting those clues and things like that, and making sure your players get those clues and basically succeed or fail, advance to the next scene, but they only advance to the next scene when they get the clue. And so basically, if you're not prepared, if you don't like the way that sets up, it also does some hidden difficulty checks, which a lot of people can get have some problems with. But all that aside, it has a really good section near the end, called basically at the end of the main book, called Stories. Which is just a section which is almost somewhat generic, which is about how do you run thrillers and spy games, and how do you do that in a scenario where you're dealing with players getting thrown into it. Because when Ian Fleming writes his spy stories, or whatever the next James Bond writer writes the script for the next James Bond movie, they control what happens and exactly when it happens, and basically the James Bond doesn't miss a clue when he's supposed to get it. The writer makes sure he puts them in front of it. He can't flub a roll or get shot or completely pick up on the wrong track and go a different direction. And instead of going to casino to have the cool showdown with the basically that you had set up there, they don't end up in a warehouse and basically in the middle of downtown because you improvised in some matchbook, but they decided to analyze the matchbook for dirt, and then flubbed the roll for it. And so now they're in a warehouse in the middle of nowhere, and you're like, what do I do with this? And so it's going to basically dealing with basically setting up basically keeping a consistent story through your players' successes and failures is going to be the key to running a successful spy game. And in order to pull basically they talk a lot about that in Night's Black Agents, and I'm going to be pulling a lot of what I'm talking about it here. I'm going to be using some of the similar terminology that they use in here because it reflects a lot of what actually I've talked about before as well. But just to know, if you want, basically, if you like what I'm talking about here in the next 20 minutes or so, and you're like, hey, can I get an actual more in-depth look at that? Night's Black Agents, even if you don't play the game, it might be worth it just to pick up the book, just to look at that section and read through that section when you're starting to plan out your game. Because the basic rhythm is the same. You're going to throw a operation, basically a plot, basically a conspiracy, something. It's going to be basically someone is threatening to destroy the world with a super laser, or it could be basically the plans, the top secret plans for this invasion, are being transferred. Are being transferred. You need to figure out. You need to intercept them. It could just be stuff like there's a delegation. There's a delegation at at this conference, and people keep going missing. Why? Or other agents in your team are getting assassinated, in your organization are being assassinated. You need to figure out who the traitor is and track them down. Get that base hook in there. Then, basically, once you've got that base hook, you need to start kind of figuring out, work backwards from there, and start figuring out what is going to lead your agents, basically your players, to that point. And start building out the spine of what this investigation is going to look at. But basically when you're doing that, you need to be basically thinking like, you can either overplan this, or you can be more broad. And it's going to be up to you how much prep work you want to put into this. I lean more towards being more improvisational because that's more my GM style. I like having a basic plan and then improvising with whatever the players throw at me, and then using my framework that I have to bounce off of that. You may want to be a little bit more, not necessarily railroady, but at least basically I have 3 different scenarios that they could go to, and so I'm going to push them into one of those 3. But you're going to what you're going to want is you're going to have your basic campaign, and you're going to have your big finish. And that's going to be basically kind of the showdown. We'll call it showdown. And that's going to be where everything leads into. Basically, your idea, your goal is likely to have, no matter what happens during the adventure, this is going to be the last thing. This is confronting the people on the space station. This is going to be confronting the mole. It's going to be getting the documents, actually getting the documents out, the heist. Whatever is your final thing that you're going to lead into is going to be that. And then you're going to The gumshoe system relies a lot on clues, and you can use kind of that same mindset when you're working through this is what leads the players to these things? What is going to make them go, basically, are they going to, basically, they're going to talk to their contacts, they're going to basically, do you want them to, how much improvisational control do you want them to have, and how much directed control do you want them to have? Do you want it to be more of a roller coaster? Where you, as the agent's basically boss, send them to talk to person A. Partway through that conversation, they die or get kidnapped or something happens, and then they get dragged. Basically, they're chasing that lead. Basically, they're chasing that person, or they're chasing basically an item that got stolen from the person. Or rushing to get to that point, and they get there, they deal with that crisis, and that gives them the information that tells them that okay, you need to go to the hotel, and so they go to the hotel, and basically there's an ambush waiting for them at a hotel, and then they go from there. That's a relatively straightforward. Your players can't really fail out of that sequence. They can stack up penalties or basically extra successes and things like that makes the next thing easier or harder. Basically, the roller coaster can go faster or slower, but it's relatively straightforward. Or you can be more like, okay, guys, here's the conference. Here is this conference, and you know the fact that one of these guys one of the person attending the conference is a double agent and plans to assassinate the keynote speaker before he gets a chance to talk. Go. And then you're basically, now you've done some research ahead of time, and you know that their players have contacts. You know that basically your players have investigative skills. Basically, you know that there's the hacker in the group, and maybe they'll rely on them. But you're going to have to be more improvisational to figure out exactly what they're going to go for, and that means you need to have those clues kind of set up in advance in terms of what is there to find. And so maybe there is basically irregularities in the accounting system. I spelled that wrong. It's gonna bug me unless I fix it. Yep. Irregulates. Thanks, Google spelling. There we go. That's better. Okay, basically, so I could have that being basically a clue that they're going to hunt, that they can hunt down. Interview attendees. Basically, and so start to kind of build up what the players could, basically leads that the players could follow, and basically kind of get those ready and basically in advance to deal with the plot basically as they do. Now, all basically, one of the things I've talked about basically, depending on how basically basically a lot of this stuff works better. Basically, a lot of this planning this tightly knit planning that we're doing here works better if you're planning a much basically playing a shorter game. If this is going to be over, basically you're running essentially episodes, like an episode of a TV series, like maybe a season like 24, where basically it's a whole basically, but it's multiple sessions, but it's not multiple year-long conspiracy type, full-blown conspiracy type thing. Because here's the thing with the more your players play, the more your players get to interact with your world, the more they're going to come up with their own cool ideas. They're going to adopt NPCs they think are important. They're going to put a lot of emphasis on a certain clue. They're going to build their own conspiracy theories. And here's the trick as a GM. Sometimes you're just going to give it to them. sometimes they're going to come up with a much cooler plot than what you have recorded in here, and you're just going to have to deal with it. And basically, again, your players don't know your notes. It'd be a very boring game if they did. And if you start to realize, well, no, okay, they've invented this cool conspiracy, and they've been ruling these cool roles and making these successful stuff, basically, but they're chasing the wrong way. It feels weird to basically, if you slam the door on them and be like, no, you've gone off the track, and I don't care that those are really cool roles, those aren't the roles in the right direction, I'm cutting you off. Your players are going to get disheartened and bored and less interested in your game. Whereas if you, because basically the big payoff that you're going for with when you're, the reason why you're building out this stuff in advance, and the reason why you want to know what the ending is before the start, before you start, is that unless you are dropping clues and hints that point at the ending, your ending isn't satisfying, especially for a spy thing. Finding out that person X was the mole or the assassin, or that that the diamonds were always in the state, basically were always back in the first hotel, or were buried under this thing, or any of those things, unless you've been building up basically these things and people have been getting these hints and figuring these things out and basically catching glances of, oh, that's why basically the person in the red coat that we saw over here, and now basically we realize that we've always only ever seen this person in a red coat. That means that it puts them there. That's when they said they were sick, or that they basically things like that. That meant, etc., etc. They get to put it all together at the end and be like, ah, it's awesome. We figured it out. We've solved it because the puzzle pieces all go together. Is much more satisfying than you just handing them a finished puzzle at the end and being like, yes, you rolled the right dice. Here's the answer. Basically, and it's all put together and dropped in front of you. It's less satisfying as a player to be handed that. And so basically what we're using Lorelink to do, basically what we're building out here are, you're building out pieces and parts and things like that that can be basically jigsawed into whichever shape your players start pushing towards. Like we have interview attendees. This is basically reasonably generic, or recognized in the accounting system. Basically, these are readily because you want these things to be ready to deal with however your players decide to get that information. But you want that information to be consistent with your ending that you already have. And maybe this turns out not to be an attendee. Maybe this turns out to be a hotel worker because they decide to quarter in a hotel worker. Maybe it ends up being basically a convention staff person because they go that route. Maybe this is actually something they call one of their contacts. And you're like, oh, okay, but I want them to get this particular information. And maybe from their contacts they get the what would be found in this clue instead, because that's more interesting. And so that's what you're building towards, is giving them the puzzle pieces and letting them piece things together how they determine they want their skills to do. Now, that said, you shouldn't be just always staring at your players and going, well, I don't know, what do you want to do? You want to have these set pieces in place so that if they hit a blank wall and they can't figure out what to do, you know places you can push them that you have set up already, so that it's not a stress on you to do it. But you know where basically you have stuff that you could throw out to them and be like, basically, if you want this to be, basically, if you want it to be an attendee, maybe basically you know the fact that you're like, oh, okay, you're going from point A to point B, but an attendee stops you and pulls you aside because they have a concern and they want to talk to you. and you can basically be like, okay, you guys got off track a bit. Let's redirect you back in with this. If your players are floundering and not knowing what to do, they're just wandering around aimlessly. Also, basically, another reason why you want to plan these events out in advance is the fact that you're going to want basically you want to have some cool set pieces that basically, again, we talked about with your players that showcase each of your players' abilities. Basically, maybe this one is more hacking for your tech player. This is more guided towards your face, basically towards your face player. Breaking into basically breaking into a delegate's room. Basically, this one's a little bit more, basically a little bit more your thief, basically your thief's basically your point of view. Basically, maybe there's basically there's a fake waiter that's at one of the conference dinners or something like that, and so you want to have a chase sequence, and so you want to have some of these things prepared in advance, so that basically you can throw them at your players and you get cool set pieces and things like that that utilize all your players' stuff. And you want these basically, and these can happen in whatever order you need them to, basically. And you may basically maybe you want to stack them in a sequence, and so what you may want to do is you may have, okay, to get to the next step, basically to get to step 1, they can either interview attendees, or they can detect irregularities in the accounting system. Both of those things can happen at step 0. Then maybe the next step after that is either the chase sequence or this. But I want this one to lead into the next one, and depending on how they got past this step, can maybe affect which one they go here. But you have multiple options for them to get that next big clue piece here. And so maybe you want to set those clues up as items that are linked to those events, so that you could be like, I'm going to be really super generic here, but like clue number 1. But now players get clue 1, or I can associate it this way. But either way, now I've got that linked. Oops, I didn't save this part. There we go. So, and I can have that on both of these things which are in clue 1, and so now I can keep track of, okay, this is what the players are looking to get from here, is this clue or this piece of information, basically this puzzle piece, etc., and I'm going to be able to track them through the adventure in terms of, okay, they go here, they need this, they need this. And basically by doing it, basically by associating it, basically we're going to have basically soon, TM. Well, basically two-way relationships will be automatic. They're not automatic for some things in this, but coming soon. But those two-way relationships are important because you'd be like, you could go to clue 1 and be like, where are all the places that players can get their basically get this clue, and they'd be like, oh, it's associated with these events, or these events, these locations, and these characters, so that you know. This is the piece of information I need my players to get next. What do I need to throw at them so that they go that direction? If you're like, oh, basically they're missing this particular piece of information, so it's associated with these characters. Can I have one of these characters send the characters a note to meet somewhere? Can I have them basically, can I have one of their contacts contact them about going into this particular room or going here? Can I have them see something strange happen and follow something stealthily back into this location to pick up the clue there? Basically, like having those clues listed and associated, it lets me be a little bit more flexible in terms of this is where I need to push my players next to get them to keep going. And it lets me be a little bit more flexible if I'm being a little bit more spontaneous, being a little bit more improvisational, to let my players determine basically drive the plot up until the point where they need help, and then being able to quickly figure out, okay, they've got clue 1, they've got clue 2, they're missing clue 3. Cool. I know how to get them to clue. I've got a couple of different options to get them to clue 3. Cool. Or if they go off track and they do some wildly cool, awesome thing where they decide that they're going to go under the hotel, and they're like, but what if we get into the food services division, and basically what if we get hired as, and if they do this entire wild plot that you didn't see coming, you could be like, okay, which clue works best for that, what they're doing, and move that clue to what they're doing, and let them keep moving beyond that point with that new information. Because basically this is something that the book talks about, that there's kind of the beats of the thriller, like a Jason Bourne, they talk about is basically you get information, you then sometimes you'll get information, and then usually basically that will trigger danger. And then they have to deal with the danger, and then they can get possibly they can get into more danger, and then basically possibly at the end of that danger they'll get more information, and basically that kind of back and forth between gaining information, which progresses the plot, and getting into danger, which bars them from continuing to go forward. And basically, last thing we're going to talk about is, before we start to wrap this up, is here's the important thing, however. And basically, Gumshoe talks about the Gumshoe system, Knights Black Agents explicitly calls it out, which is basically your players should always fail forward, as it were, but they should fail forward with consequences. Don't stall your game because of dice rolls. I don't say there's a YouTube skit I saw which is basically somewhere basically like, oh no, basically RPGs are not video games. You cannot soft lock a TTRPG game. Basically, if you're like, oh, there's an important piece of information in this room, and everybody flubs their perception checks because basically to find it, you shouldn't just shrug and be like, well, I guess the game doesn't work anymore. You end up with basically let them find it, but at a cost. Let them find it with future consequences. There's always let them know they're on the right track, but they have to face danger to get to it now. Basically, that's not just something like as simple as a perception check. That is like, basically like the bad guy got away with the briefcase with the item that they need in it. Now they have to go get that briefcase, but now there's going to be a fight scene between it and it. There's a chase sequence now between them and the item. They need to spend resources to stop it from happening. They need to basically, if there's a system where they can spend stuff to be like, oh, basically all along we had this planned or this planned. If you're running Blades in the Dark is another system you can run it's less aimed towards thriller. It's more more criminal, but you could use it. But that same the devil's bargain that system always offers, which is you can get this, but here's the cost for it. You're going to break this piece of equipment. You're going to burn this contact. You're going to push them too hard to get it. You're going to get a warning note from your head office that you've gotten too close on this case. They're looking to pull you off if you don't get your emotions back in control. Things like that. Basically, consequences and things like that. Don't soft lock your game because you put a clue or an important piece of basically a plot progression behind something you forced your players to dice roll against. Failure in an AD&D system a lot of times has that already built into it. You missed your attack, which means that you're more likely to get hit back. You're going to lose some of your hit points. You're going to have to your cleric is going to have to use a heal spell to heal you. Your armor is going to get damaged. You're going to have to spend a spell in order to get past this fight because you failed some earlier rolls. That back and forth is built into it. You're used to that. You're used to your players accept flubbing an attack roll in D&D. The fight doesn't end if your players don't perfectly fight. A game shouldn't end. A spy game shouldn't end because your players flub detection. Just basically the costs are a little bit less obvious in this situation. You need to be prepared and be willing to oh, okay, here's what the cost is. Here's what I'm willing to push players to give, or here's the consequences I'm willing to put on top of them, whether immediate or not, that they have to deal with. So one last thing I do want to talk about before. The cool thing about real world, about running games in the more modern time period, is locations become a lot easier. You can just say Miami, and now if you Google Miami, you can get a bunch of cool locations in Miami that will likely have maps and addresses and pictures and a bunch of cool stuff. If you're like, oh, I want them to go to the there's probably a museum of dinosaurs in Miami. You can look it up. Get pictures of what's in there, where its location is, what it's determined on, if you want them to have a meetup there or something like that. You want a cool dockside, a cafe? There are millions of them. You can pull them, pull them up, and dump the information in there, pull the maps out of Google Maps or whatever, and be able to just throw that, be able to quickly throw it at them. It also means the fact that if you need to improvise, if your players decide to go to a warehouse, it isn't hard to find, to Google Miami, to Google a map of what a warehouse looks like and grab a quick map of it. Possibly finding one that's in Miami. It makes it, locations, don't be afraid to use real world locations with the serial numbers filed off of them. Like, there probably isn't a museum called the Museum of Dinosaurs, but in your world it's called the Museum of Dinosaurs, and you're using whatever the Miami State Museum is, or the Miami Museum of History actually is. And you're using it for yours. And basically throwing those things into Lore Lake and using the hierarchy system to make sure you've got an easy way of keeping them all clustered together. It makes it easy for you to do your globe trotting for when your players decide they want to go to Miami, or maybe next time you send them to Milan, or maybe they go to Paris. You could have all these cool cities, and because they're jet-setting secret agents, maybe they bounce back and forth between them on various different adventures that you put them in, and you don't have to keep track of what that Paris bakery was. You've already got it created, basically, and the NPC you used, basically, that basically is running the secret spy agency in Paris out of the back of a bakery. Basically, you've got that already set up, you've got that information there, and you can find it relatively quickly by just pulling, basically, by popping open Paris. All of that is easy, relatively straightforward. Basically, it's quick, basically lets you find it quickly. And basically, you can save time on your. Don't invent entire fictional cities. Basically, take real world ones and maybe piece them together. Maybe your fictional city is a combination of Chicago and Seattle. Basically, you mash together basically cool buildings and other stuff and parks and other things from both of those. But you don't have to invent it whole cloth. You don't have to come up with basically architectural and street drawings and things like that and try to figure out what's next to what and things like that. Google Street View is a great tool for what's on a street. What's on a busy street in a high rent part of Chicago on a magnificent $1 million mile. what's on the street in one of the artier parts of basically Seattle. Cool. Drop yourself in there. What does Central Park look like? What does an urban park look like? Cool. You could just look up Central Park and drop that in there and be able to basically pull that into basically your spies are having a meeting at a park. You can pull together what that looks like. All right. So, all of that to say, thank you for listening. Basically, spies and spy stuff are really cool. Basically, they're a great way of basically throwing mysteries. They're also cool in the fact that they can be very episodic. Basically, they also be good from the standpoint they're really fun to have players if you have a group which is a little bit more scattered in terms of who attends how often. If you're like basically this week we have 3 players, this week we have 5 players. Sometimes we have basically so not all the players can attend every game. Then it's, okay, this week we're working on this. Basically, here's your mission. Is to basically the guy pulls together this guy, and this guy for this mission, because that's who we have available for this week. And then when you're planning out the mission, you're pulling on those 3. You know that those three people are going to be there, so you're pulling on those 3 particular skill set. And you're tailing the episode, as it were. Excuse me, towards them. So. Basically, they're great. Give them a try. Figure out what works best for your group. And kind of basically have fun. Basically, propose that sort of thing. Basically, see what. Basically, not everything has to be another D&D game. You can try something different. Okay. So, all of that to say, this has been LoreLink. If you've been interested in any of the stuff I've been showing off here, basically the linking, basically the mention system, all of that cool stuff, all of that is available in the LoreLink. Basically, you can check that out. Basically, LoreLink has now exited early access. It is available to the public. Basically, anyone can basically sign up for an account. You can get your free account to get started, which gets you 2 free campaigns. Basically, I'm holding up 2 fingers, but you can't see them because I'm holding up the wrong ones. 2 free campaigns, and that will, and basically they'll get you a good start on stuff. The one thing it doesn't get you is player sharing. And the player sharing feature would be great if you're looking to share dossiers or information on contacts and other stuff with your players. But if you're just looking to store stuff, you can start off and just get the free tier, see how things work together, then upgrade to the paid tier. They get the cool features like the ability to put hotspots on those city maps we talked about, build out templates if you need to, basically if you want to quickly reproduce goons or thugs or basically other gadgets and other stuff. You want to be able to quickly just create different versions of them in system. That is a great way to do that is with templates, and so those are available at the paid tier as well. So basically, you can check that Get Started link out. That's going to tell you about how to do that, and then you can sign up for basically one of the higher account when you decide you want more campaigns, more storage space, or some of those paid features I just talked about. In the meantime, basically, don't forget, basically, I talked about it at the beginning, I'll talk about it at the end. This Friday at 1 p.m., basically, we will be doing Conspiracy of the Red Book, which is a One Ring adventure, which will be run by my compatriot Michael Den. He will be running basically running that adventure for the Lorelink players, including myself. So I get to play. It's always fun. It's always good when I get to do that. Um, and basically we'll have other friends of the streams like 20 and Luna and Wolf Mom will be on that stream. So check that out this Friday at 1 p.m. If you want to know more about basically when streams go live, if you basically know what we're doing in the future and things like that, basically you can always follow this channel right here. Click that follow button. It's absolutely free here on Twitch. And it'll let you know when we go live. It'll send you a message. Basically send you a quick, cool message telling you, oh, hey, Mark's talking about spy games today, or Mark's talking about superheroes, or other stuff. So you can check those out there. Basically, you could come check it out when you need to, when you click the follow button. If you wish to subscribe, that would be even more awesome. We always appreciate it as a tip for you. Basically, thanks for, hey, that information was useful. I appreciate that. Here's a small thanks. Especially if you want to use the Amazon Prime Gaming sub, takes money out of Jeff Bezos' pocket, puts us into ours, and we guarantee the fact that, unlike Jeff Bezos, we won't spend that money on a yacht. Well, okay, maybe an in-game yacht, but that's about it. Basically, if you're watching this over on YouTube, if you came in later, you want to check out some of the other streams, I talked about Outgunned and Feng Shui, if you want to check out those systems, all of those are available and archived. All these streams are archived on our YouTube channel over, basically, it is currently being broadcast on YouTube. And of course, if you're over there, we always ask that you poke the algorithm a little slightly if you're interacting with our videos. Like the videos, subscribe to the channel, leave a comment on the video saying you like that or there's a cool system you want us to check out. Do all that on those videos. We always appreciate that as well. Lastly, if you want to keep up with basically of us talking about, kind of chatting about random things, basically TTRPG related or cool features or other stuff, there are 2 ways to follow us. Depending on 2 ways to follow us, I'm going to remember to use this hand. 2 ways to follow us if you're interested in basically keeping up with that. There's our Blue Sky account. Ooh, Yacht Rock CD. Or there's our Blue Sky account where we do random off the cuff things like talk about rock CDs. Also talk about cool basically TTRPG accessories and other cool things, sales and other stuff. So that's a great way if you want to keep up to date with that. You can check us out there on that Blue Sky. If you're avoiding social media for obvious reasons, and you just want to be like, hey, just give me the cool updates. I just want to basically just drop them in my inbox once a month. Basically, we have a newsletter. Basically, in that newsletter, which is basically we don't spam your inbox. Basically, we've gotten a little bit more excited more recently because we had a bunch of cool stuff to talk about. And I think we up to like maybe 2, maybe 3 pieces of email, and that's like extreme for us. Normally, it's just 1 a month, but it'll give you cool information about the streams we're having, the streams which are upcoming, new development features, and possibly cons and other stuff that we'll be at. And of course, on that last note, if you want to see us in person, we will be live at Gen Con. We will not have a booth this year, but we will have a workshop on what to do before your first session. Nope, 2. Oh, 3 is too much work. Oh, okay, we got 2. We got all the way up to 2 people. Crisis averted, we didn't get all the way to 3. But there is basically we'll be at Gen Con, but what to do before your first session. Basically, I and Mike will be running that one. Mike will be running his basically running the Pendragon and One Ring campaigns, which he has been talking about here on stream. All of those are available basically in the Gen Con event system. If you go over to Gen Con's website, you search for Lorelink, you'll see all of the panels that we are presenting. And if you sign up for those, basically we'll get to see you in person. And best of all, if you sign up for our basically what to do before your first session, that one, you can basically, here's a secret tip, you'll get a 3-month coupon for Multiverse level from basically for Lorelink if you go there. There's also some other physical goodies we give away in person as well, like bullet notepads and pencils, other cool things. But you have to show up to get those. You have to sign up for those on the account. So check those. Basically, check those out if you're if you're interested in those. All right, that will do it for me. Basically, thank you all for listening, and basically have a great night. Catch you all later.